Negotiating your own deal is one of the hardest things about real estate when it comes to picking the right price that suits you as a seller or as a buyer, understanding the terms of a contract, and how to actually take that contract from pending all the way through a closing. And that's what we're here to talk about. Hey, my name is Noah McBride with Century 21 Magnolia, and today we're talking about negotiating your deal and finding out the best terms for you. So one of the most common neglects we see are things that are playing into a contract aside from just the purchase price. There's often negotiations both at going under contract, the inspection period, other contingencies, and the appraisal along the way. Now, cash buyers do not have that same instance necessarily, but all the other factors still apply. And so when you're negotiating your deal, there's often a lot of things to consider beyond just sales price. Now, let's start at sales price. Yes, the price of your home is important, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, if the buyer on your home, or if you are the buyer looking to purchase a home and you're trying to offer more than that property is actually worth, you're going to run into an appraisal hiccup at the end, which we'll get to. But when a buyer, seller are negotiating price, it's important to consider a lot of things like market value, where the current trends are, and how is the property going to be perceived, right? Assuming you've already negotiated the price, there's a couple other factors that do come in, such as earnest money, which is how much money you are going to be putting up for due diligence and towards the closing. If you're curious to know more about that, we have another video that you can watch directly on earnest money. You have your due diligence period here in Georgia and South Carolina that play a factor, which is essentially a buyer's timeline for inspections where they could terminate the contract at little to no penalty, depending on if there's other terms written into the contract. Other popular contingencies we see are a sale or lease contingency. If a buyer is looking to purchase a home with funds received from selling or renting out a property they currently own. Other contingencies include specific inspections, like if you have an older home, maybe it's an asbestos inspection, maybe it's specific zoning. If it's commercial, you get into a whole new array of different contingencies. But essentially, a buyer and seller can negotiate almost any contingency you can think of as long as you're mutually accepting the contract. Now, continuing there, the next negotiation you're really going to run into is going to be that due diligence contingency. So through inspections, any requested for repairs or a price reduction that comes from the buyer to the seller, that's going to be your next negotiation. So just because you're under contract on the original offer does not necessarily, even on an as-is offer, mean that you're going to close at that price. Even on as-is, typically we'll see a buyer who gets cold feet go to the seller and say, look, if you don't drop the price by this much money or do this repair, we're going to walk, and yes, we'll lose whatever little bit of earnest money we put up. Now, that earnest money is supposed to protect you, but let's say it's $500 and you've been under contract for 45 days. Typically, that $500 is not the most important thing to you as much as getting the full value of the home back at the closing. So, that's the next one, is negotiating repairs, requests for reduce in sales price, increase, negotiating closing costs, figuring out, okay, so we had closing costs originally factored in, but it turns out the buyer needs more to close. Are you, if you're the seller, going to go up in price, go down in price? Those are a couple things to consider within the due diligence timeline that typically come up. The next most popular one is that appraisal negotiation. So oftentimes, especially in today's market, we saw values jump a ton over the last 3 to 5 years. With that in mind, appraisers have started backing down on what their sales price is, and we're seeing a lot of appraisals come in a little short of what the purchase price looks to be. So if you're in a market where the home is rapidly appreciating but it is cooling off, that's another thing to consider, is the appraiser going to look at this and provide the bank with the right number for the sales price to give the buyer the loan on the property. Just this week I got a call from a friend of mine who was talking about a buyer that had an off-market deal where they thought that the bank was going to lend them $160,000, but it only appraised for $154,000. The buyer and seller didn't understand that the appraisal does impact the sales price and how the buyer is going to be able to close. So that's something you definitely need to consider when negotiating your deal, is are you negotiating a sales price that will actually be able to get approved by an appraisal, and are you going to have that? Now, oftentimes we have an additional chance to negotiate. If the appraisal comes in high, no, the seller cannot come to the buyer and say, look, it's worth $10,000 more, you owe me 10 grand. That's not how that works. But let's say you're a buyer and you're looking to get extra closing costs. Oftentimes you can negotiate with a seller to pay a little bit more on that appraised value and pull a little more closing costs to go towards the cost of purchasing the home. Those are a couple different negotiations. Also, things that negotiate are if that appraisal's short, we typically will do a tidewater or try to dispute the appraisal if we feel like it is wrong or just off by a little bit. So we'll send in additional comps to the appraiser with the bank knowing, and then they're able to reevaluate it And now not always do we get a chance for their appraised value to go up, but it is something that we're able to consider, and every now and then the appraiser will adjust their price that they appraise it at, and it'll end up favoring either the buyer or seller and make the deal work out in the end. Now, real estate has a million different negotiations, and I'm sure there's plenty that I've missed in this video, such as sale or lease contingencies, terms, additional, but if we went through the whole contract, this video would be an hour and a half long, and I know that you did not come here today to watch an hour and a half video on negotiated contracts. So, if you're curious to know more, reach out to us. We'd love to help. Once again, I'm Noah with Central Magnolia, and we'll see you again next time.